Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ying Zheng, the Director of Asian Initiatives at Western Michigan University's Haneke Institute for Global Education. I also serve as the Director of Timothy Light Center for Chinese Studies. And welcome to Timothy Light Center's webinar series of Fall 2022. Our theme for this semester's webinar is Environment. Today, we're honored to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Judy Shapiro from American University. I would like to invite Dr. Carla Kerwinsky, the Dean of our College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Geosciences, to introduce Dr. Shapiro to us. Carla, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ying. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you here today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, both as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and also as a faculty member in the Geological and Environmental Sciences and Environment and Sustainability units here in the college. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's seminar, which is sponsored by both the Timothy Light Center for Chinese Studies and also the Haneke Institute for Global Education, and to introduce our guest, Dr. Judith Shapiro. Before I introduce our guest, I was just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Just a reminder, if you are not muted, please check and make sure that you are muted. And then the other thing I wanted to add is we will leave plenty of time for discussion at the end of the presentation today. You are welcome to put your questions into the chat or raise your hand, and I will moderate questions at the end of the presentation today. So let me introduce our guest. Professor Judith Shapiro currently serves as the director of the master's program in Natural Resources and Sustainable Development for the School of International Service at American University. She earned her PhD in International Relations from American University and holds an MA in Asian Studies from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as an MA in Comparative Literature from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. She earned a BA from Princeton University, where she studied both anthropology and also East Asian studies. Dr. Shapiro was one of the first Americans to live in China after US-China relations were normalized in 1979, and she taught English at the Hunan Teachers College in Changsha, China. Her research and her teaching focus on global environmental politics and policy, the environmental politics of Asia, and Chinese politics under Mao. She is author, co-author, or editor of 10 books, one of which inspired a documentary, and her early experiences in China were made into a television feature film. Today, we welcome Dr. Shapiro virtually, and thank you everyone for joining us, especially our many students who are here today, for a seminar titled China Planet, Environmental Implications of the Rise of China. Dr. Shapiro.
Hi, everybody. I've been looking forward to this all day, if not all week, all month, ever since Professor Ying Zheng invited me. So it's so good to be here with you, with new friends, old friends. And yeah, I want to thank the Timothy Light Center and the other center that begins with an H. That sounds very complicated. So yeah, it's really great to be with you. I'm going to do a presentation in a few different parts. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, because it's always more interesting to know a little about who you're hearing from and give us a sense of how China came to be in the situation it is. Then I'm going to talk about the Chinese people's response to the intense pollution that they're experiencing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chinese state's response to that. And then I'm going to finish up with a conversation about the impact of China's rise on the global environment. And I'm going to try to persuade you today that even if you're not interested in China, even if you're not interested in the environment, these two things coming together are really important for all of us to know at least a little bit about. So I am going to try to share my screen, and with luck, it's going to work. So we'll see. Is that good? And let me just check the shifting is not working. Let me shift up and down. Oh, this happens sometimes when you open it and then you close. Let me close this. Let me stop the share for a second and try it again. I want to be able to go back and forth. So let me share my screen. It's not moving. Maybe I have to put it on. Now you're seeing all of it, right? Now it's going. Okay. All right. And are we seeing the full screen? Or do I have to do something else for that?
You need to start the slideshow.
Okay. Okay, good. All right. So here we are, environmental implications of the rise of China. First of all, I want to underline one thing so that the people in my graduate admissions department don't get mad at me. If some of you are undergraduates and you're interested in coming to Washington, D.C. to do a master's degree, we have 2 great master's degrees, so please don't forget about us. And feel free to contact me directly if you're interested in anything I've said, I'm going to say today, or in our master's programs. All right, so first of all, let's go back. I hope you can see the family resemblance here. I like to show this slide because I think it establishes my credentials. I've been involved with China since 1972 when I started my Chinese language study, and I came to live in China in 1977, where I became a teacher. And here you can see that I was fortunate enough to be able to blend in pretty well, unlike all the other foreigners. I was the only foreigner in my province initially, and you can imagine that that would have been really difficult if I weren't short and dark. All right. So since I've been involved with China some 40-some years, there's been a dizzying transformation. China has become extremely wealthy, but there are enormous costs to bear from that. So on the one hand, we have Shanghai, which is more modern than any city that you could possibly find in America. And you have this consuming going on. But let's remember that all of this consuming that's going on, all this manufacturing, is not only happening within China, but in a sense, China has become the manufacturing hub of the world, right? So all of the pollution that China is experiencing is in some ways also the pollution that belongs to you and me. And I think that's a really important point. In environmental politics, we always talk about the displacement of environmental harm. So in some ways, the US and other developed countries have outsourced their pollution to China and to other developing countries. So here's some slides to give you a sense of the costs of this. Very famous images of this e-cycling business that goes on in the southern part of the country. It's changed quite a bit. Now the Chinese are saying no more, we're not going to take in this kind of trash. Here you can barely see it, but this is actually Tiananmen Square and the Forbidden City there in the background. People trying to pursue a traditional Chinese art. Industrial accidents are very common. You can see this chemical spill. A lot of times we hear only about the pollution in the Beijing area, but here's an image from Gansu in the west. So it's really a nationwide kind of a problem. You can barely see the skyline here, right? Another traditional art being conducted in the smog. Cadmium spill, another heavy metal accident in Guangxi in the southwestern part of the country. And here, this is interesting to me, particularly this was already now a while ago, but so many pigs died of a porcine coronavirus, and they were dumped in the drinking water of Shanghai. And Shanghai is considered the sort of Paris of Asia. It's the most sophisticated city. And so the upshot that I want to underline here is that the Chinese people, as they've gotten quote unquote rich, have started to feel as if they can't trust the air that they're breathing. They can't trust the food that they're eating. You know, heavy metals gets taken up into the rice. There's heavy metals in the tea. They can't trust the water that they're drinking. There was a big run on infant formula some years ago because the infant formula was contaminated with melamine. So they can't trust the food that they're feeding to their little kids. And so, and they get these, you know, accidents like this one. So this leads the Chinese people to start to question the amazing development that they've experienced and ask, is this really the development that we want? Now, there's a theory that economists out there will tell you about called the environmental Kuznets curve. And that argues that as any country develops, they'll tolerate a certain degree of pollution until a certain level of development is achieved. And then there'll be some kind of recalibration, and then they'll clean it up and essentially outsource it. So some have said that China's on the summit, if you will, of the environmental Kuznets curve, but I think it's more complicated than that. So I'm going to go quickly, if I can. I've got a lot of material for you today, but to go into how the Chinese people have responded to this pollution in organized civil society groups, and then also how the Chinese state is responding. So on the one hand, ironically, some Chinese people have gone back to farming. They've been trying to leave being peasants for so long, and yet now they have to like grow their own vegetables on their own balconies because at least they know that there's no heavy metals in the vegetables. There's been a range of responses. If you're interested in this kind of thing, I have some articles on it or a chapter in one of my books, or you could just photograph this. I won't belabor this, but there's a range of citizen responses, and I can give you some examples of some of these. So on the one hand, this goes back in the day. This is Liang Congjie. He was the founder of China's environmental movement in a structured sort of way. In 1994, he founded Friends of Nature. And I saw there's a lot of Chinese people in the audience, so I'll just say quickly that he was Liang Qichao's grandson and Liang Sicheng's son. So those Chinese people in the audience will understand that his grandfather and father were incredibly famous people within China, and that allowed him to have the freedom to create this first Chinese non-governmental organization, which was a very risky thing to do in those days. And he started out with something called information politics, where he was publicizing the poaching of the Tibetan antelope, which was used for its very fine fur and made into scarves that were mostly exported. Now, the Chinese government tolerated this. They didn't really realize that this would catch on to the imagination of the young people throughout China. And there was a moment there in the 90s, actually starting in the 80s, where there was, right after Mao died in the late 70s, and gradually the space for organizing and for free speech started to widen and widen. It was particularly wide for environmental issues, not for human rights. So a lot of people who were interested in pushing China towards a more open society got involved in the environmental space. Now that space has closed, but we'll get to that later. So anyway, here was the antelope car. He went around telling people about the Tibetan antelope. This famous young couple did something which we call bearing witness, which is a Quaker phrase. It means when you see something bad, you should bear witness to it. It's a phrase that Greenpeace uses a lot. And in this case, they were at his hometown in Southwest China. They saw a lot of illegal logging going on that was threatening the habitat of this wonderful monkey. And they stuck around and they filmed it, and they wouldn't let the loggers log. And these pictures of these monkeys have become the iconic symbol of the Chinese environmental movement. Yeah. Another method that the Chinese people have used is so-called undercover investigations. And in this case, this person who used to be my graduate student and was then the head of Greenpeace East Asia for a while. So let's say you're a farmer and you say, oh my God, there's awful stuff going into my pool here. Call Greenpeace, and Greenpeace would sneak down often in the dead of night, because some of these local factory bosses are, they're kind of have thugs. It's actually really dangerous. Take a water sample, and then you can see this water looks awfully purple. They'll send this water to Amsterdam or London, where they're really sophisticated laboratories. And depending on what they find out, they might then launch a citizen campaign. So this was a very famous campaign in the 90s called the Detox campaign. The X is the same as the character for water. And they were pointing out that all these multinational corporations, Adidas, Nike, Burberry, a long list of them, were dumping chemicals into the Yangtze River as part of dyeing this mostly fast fashion kind of clothing. And so what's interesting about this, if you're a political scientist, is this detox campaign is a way of using social media for a civil society group to go directly to the consumer. It's not really about influencing the state so much. It's a very horizontal kind of, we call it naming and shaming. And it's a tool that wouldn't be available if we didn't have the internet. So this was very, very effective. They also mentioned Zara in this campaign. And you can imagine if you're Zara, you don't want this kind of image to be out there. Young people are hip, right? They're going to say, oh, maybe I better not buy Zara anymore. So what happens is then Zara says, okay, we'll stop. We won't dump chemicals into the Yangtze anymore. Yeah, and so this was a very, very successful campaign. Another example of what ordinary people can do is they engage in so-called symbolic politics. So in this case, this was a situation where there was a park that was supposed to be part of a panda reserve, but the local leaders found phosphate and they decided to ignore the park, and they created these phosphate mines to make money. And so all you need here, this is actually not a real panda, everybody. Joke. All you need is a panda suit and like a selfie camera, and you create an image like this of the panda weeping, and then you try to make this image go viral, and you can put a lot of pressure then on the local official, who then has to close the mine. Here's another environmental hero. His name is Ma Jun. He is the founder of a group that's focused on information transparency, basically getting information into the hands of the people so that people know, how bad is my air today? How bad is my water today? Which is the factory that's polluting the most? If you live in China, everybody's got these apps, right? And the first thing you're going to do every morning is like, look at how bad is the pollution? Can my child go out to play today? Can I take my bicycle to work, or do I need to take my car? Which makes things even worse, right? So he's wonderful. And then we also have a certain kind of celebrity activism going on. Yao Ming, the famous basketball star, has been very active on biodiversity issues and endangered species. So he has, shark fin apparently doesn't taste like much of anything. It's just cartilage, is like your fingernail, right? But they put it in soup to make the soup thick, and it's a kind of status symbol. And so he created this anti-shark finning campaign. When you take the fins off sharks, it's a particularly awful thing to do to the shark as well. And so he has kind of single-handedly, together with this group Wild Aid, made shark fin soup not fashionable anymore. And the Communist Party has banned it from the banquets, and the high-end hotels don't have it anymore. People always say you can get it in the back room for a price, but it's been very effective. Then we also have people who become activists, not in an organized way, but because, let's say, they found out that some awful factory is being built in their town. And then in order to circumvent the censorship, because in China, you can't say, let's have a demonstration, or let's get a permit to have a demonstration. That's not allowed. So instead, they use the internet saying, let's all go for a walk. Do you want to go for a walk? I'll meet you for a walk, and because they can't really filter out the word go for a walk. And so some of these going for a walk protests end up being pretty big protests. They call them environmental mass incidents, right? So in this case, they're protesting against an incinerator. In this case, this taking a walk protest was against a planned petrochemical complex in Dalian, and you can see a lot of people say no PX, right? They're saying no PX plant. And in this case, the mayor said, oops, okay, we're not going to do this. Now, before we get too happy about all this, we have a phrase in environmental politics called NIMBYism. I don't know if all of you know this term, but it means not in my backyard, NIMBY. So NIMBYism, you can say, wow, these are educated middle-class people in urban centers. So they're able to organize themselves in such a way to say no to these bad things. We also call them Lulus. Do you know what a Lulu is? Who knows what a Lulu is? Locally undesirable land use. So the NIMBYists don't want the Lulus in their backyard, right? So they'll organize themselves. And what this often means then, we talked about displacement of environmental harm. What this often means then is that the bad activity shifts to more vulnerable people. It shifts to the countryside. It shifts to ethnic minority nationalities. It may even shift to outside of China, where maybe the people of Cambodia can't resist this kind of activity. So we should recognize and give these people a lot of credit, but also be aware of where the undesirable activity then goes. Now, in all this action, journalists have a special role to play. Many of the heads of these organizations are former journalists, but in this case, this guy, Liu Jianqiang, he was fighting a dam on the New River and on the Songhua River, actually at Tiger Leaping Gorge, a very famous place if some of you have been to China and toured around a bit. And, you know, he was able to publish a story that explained that these dams did not use a good EIA or environmental impact assessment. But, you know, he stopped the dam, but ultimately he was fired from his job. And then he had another job for a while. And ultimately he was then squeezed out of the country. So I think he lives in California now. Yeah, here's another example of the special role for journalists. You should all look up this documentary Under the Dome if you have a chance. So in about three short weeks in March of 2015, this documentary was available all over the Chinese internet. People have calculated that maybe 1/5 of the Chinese people saw it in those 3 short weeks until the government shut it down. And the story here was she was pregnant and her fetus, her baby, had a tumor. And she realized that this tumor could be related to the air pollution. So she created this very successful documentary. I'll show you a couple of clips from it. Here, she asked the little girl, have you ever seen a blue sky? She says no, she'd never seen clouds, never seen the stars. So this is a very human-centered documentary, an anthropocentric documentary. This isn't about pandas or anything like that. It's about human health. And, you know, everybody loves their children, but I would say the Chinese people really love their children. And this really got people upset that a little girl like this had never seen the stars because the air was so bad. Okay, so she called on people. She said, you know, we should stand up and do something. And in fact, what people did was they immediately started to download these apps that I mentioned earlier from the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs. So they would have better information transparency. And they started doing things like citizen science, where if you saw something bad, you could upload it. And with a GPS would tell the organization exactly where the factory was. And so they could really start to push back by using information, okay? So I'm almost done with this citizen response business. Another response, a kind of breaking, a new kind of technique has been litigation. And so environmental litigation can be hard to win, because often it's hard to prove that pollution has caused, say, a cancer cluster. Sometimes it takes years and years for cancers to emerge. You know, it's hard to point to the tort or the liability. And oftentimes, you know, maybe whoever did the damage has sold the factory or sold the land. But anyway, this environmental public interest litigation network is very successful. In this case, some some high school kids started to get sick because there was basically a contaminated site, and they built a really fancy high school on there, and then people started getting sick. All right, so the Chinese government responds. So you would say, well, what happens here now when the Chinese government is all of a sudden talking about ecological civilization? Yeah, that's ecological civilization is part of the Constitution, not only the Constitution of the country, but it's also part of the Constitution of the Communist Party. And so I would say that the reason the Chinese government is responding is twofold. First of all, the very legitimacy of the CCP is at risk if people are so fed up with all this pollution. And second of all, the Chinese state understands that the environmental crisis is also, in the long run, a security crisis for them, particularly with respect to climate change. So let's see. This is a cover of the most recent book that I did together with Yifei Li, and Yifei Li is going to be speaking to you in a few weeks. So I hope everybody will come back for Yifei Li. So we wrote a book in which we decided we wanted to have a very close look at what ecological civilization means to ordinary Chinese people as it is implemented by the Chinese state. Yeah. So, and we wrote the book for two reasons. First of all, we found that a lot of international observers were also frustrated that the pace of dealing with our crisis, whether it's the biodiversity crisis or the climate change crisis, or even the ozone depletion crisis, which has gotten a little better, it sounds like the democratic process is too slow. It's not keeping up with basically the pace in which international environmental law is being written and implemented is not adequate to the challenges that we face. And so when Xi Jinping makes statements like this, clear waters and green mountains are gold mountains and silver mountains, then people say, well, maybe China has the answer. And in scholarship, the exploration is around what's called environmental authoritarianism, right? It's like, or authoritarian environmentalism. We'll figure out which one we have here. But, the idea is that maybe what we need is a green dictator, and then, so we wanted to investigate this. And the other reason we wanted to do this book was that we found that in the name of environmental protection, the Chinese state has been doing some things that they would like to do for a long time, like forcibly relocating nomads. States don't like nomads, right? Anthropologists always write about this. States don't like nomads because they're moving all around and the state can't control them. So here we say, oh, look, you nomads, your animals are tearing up the grasslands. We want to create a big park here to save biodiversity. So you better move into the city here where we can, give you a few dollars and make you realize that Chinese civilization is the way to go. All right, anyway, so ecological civilization. These are some quotations from some of these party documents. Yeah, new vision of green development, a way of life and work that's green, low carbon, circular, and sustainable. I mean, this sounds like such great stuff. So what does it really look like on the ground? Well, before I go into what does it really look like on the ground, I have a slide here that talks about the security risk. Now, let me just take a moment to say, a lot of my students are eager to write about what they call the climate change movement in China. And actually, as I've tried to show, ordinary people are really worried about food, air, water, these kinds of very close-in kinds of pollution and public health problems. They're also worried about animals to an extent, but they're less aware of the problems of climate change, partly because the state has been saying, don't worry, we'll take care of it. It's real, but we'll take care of it. But the state, I would say, we've got lots of engineers and scientists who are running the Communist Party of China, very technocratic approach. So they're aware that sea level rise could put Shanghai underwater, as you see in this picture. they're aware that the glacier is melting on the Tibetan plateau, which is called the third pole. So much water is contained in the Himalayas, that it keeps feeding the waters of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and China. But as these glaciers melt, you get short-term flooding, and then long-term, the aquifers fall and there isn't enough water. So you could actually have a situation where the people of Beijing don't have enough water to sustain that city. Okay, so the state, the long-term planners are aware that this is a security threat. And the other aspect of the climate change as a security threat is the extreme weather events. So we all know that these hurricanes, or typhoons they call them in China, they have more moisture, they're more violent, there's more drought, and that's more devastating. So anyway, so this is, I would say, this one of the reasons the state is worried about this. Now, okay, so how has the state approached this? Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all this, but this is our table of contents, and I'll give you a taste of some of these things. That we were interested in seeing what the tools are that the Chinese state uses in order to achieve its environmental goals, and we discovered that very often these environmental goals also serve to increase the level of control by the state over the individual. Yeah, so you can see these. Yeah, you can see these. Just look at them quickly. All right, let's go to the next one. So here's an example of, sometimes they'll do these campaigns where in the very short run, because there'll be something like the Olympics in 2008 or APEC meeting in 2014, or some kind of Communist Party anniversary, or a meeting of the G20, they'll go bend over backwards to make the skies blue, right? And this means that for your ordinary person, you're not allowed to drive your car. The factory has to shut down. You have to stay home. You're not even allowed, if somebody dies in your family, you're not allowed to burn the funeral money that's supposed to send them off to a good life, because that would put some smoke in the air. So the ordinary Chinese person's response, and this is just supposed to be a decoration here that you see, but you can see that the ordinary Chinese person's response is twofold. On the one hand, they go, ooh, the sky can be really blue. This is really nice. This is really nice. And then on the second fold, they think, it seems as if the Chinese state cares more about these foreign visitors than they care about us, So they only make it look pretty for the foreigners, but they don't care about us. So that's one of the sort of unexpected outcomes of these campaigns. Quantitative target setting. Oh my God, what a nightmare if you are a local official. So you're supposed to meet these kinds of very specific, to the digit. I mean, look at this one, forest cover rate, 23.04%, so you have to, when it's time for you to get promoted, or evaluated, or maybe your salary goes up or down, whatever, they're going to check and see whether you did all these things correctly. Crazy, right? So here's a story that will illustrate the problem. A few summers ago in Henan province, it was time for the evaluation, and it was also time to bring in the grain. And so the threshing machines threw a lot of chaff into the air. And the chaff registered on the pollution machines as being off the charts, right? It seemed like the air was terribly polluted. So what did the local officials do? They said, nobody uses the threshing machines this summer. We're not going to bring in the grain with the threshing machines. And so the farmers were like they lost their whole crop that year just because of the need for local officials to meet these quantitative targets. Okay, just a couple more examples. So I already mentioned this a little bit. So they're using something they're calling ecological migration to force nomads into settlements. Here's some nomads who are supposed to be happy about it. It didn't work out, just like it didn't work out when Native Americans were forced into settlements in American history. These are people whose whole identities and cultures rest on their nomadic cultures. And so what happens initially is, it's okay. And then they just turn to, they get diseases and they feel unhappy and depressed, and it's a really bad thing. So it basically tries to wipe out whole civilizations in the name of environmental protection. So as somebody who cares about the environment and cares equally about human rights, I'm really offended by this use of environmental arguments to suppress people's human rights. Honey ginger tea, I recommend it. Okay, and one more example of the state's response. I mentioned that these a very technocratic approach. So in this case, the scientists have figured out that they can use cloud seeding machines to try to make it rain on the Tibetan plateau, because I mentioned about the glacier melt, and there's a lot of concern about the glacier melt. So nobody really knows. They're putting tens of thousands of these silver iodide shooting machines on the Tibetan plateau to catch the monsoon rains that are coming up from India. No one really knows that if this degree of use of silver iodide will be contaminating in the long run. No one really knows if this will affect India's water supply, if the monsoons are made to rain on Tibet. So anyway, this is an image. The source you can see is wonderful engineering, but that overall is the approach that the Chinese state has used, rather than to try to get people to buy in, to trust the people, to figure out, how solutions can work such that in the long run they can be sustainable. Because if the people don't agree with some of these methods, then in the long run they're going to fail. All right. If we were in person, I would say, are there any questions? But now we're moving to our third section. And let me see, I'm talking away here, but I have a lot to say. Okay, so the global environmental impacts of China's rise. I think for our convenience, we can divide them into three big baskets. So first of all, Chinese traditional medicine has been using species, some of which are endangered, for millennia. But now that there's an enormous wealth in the middle class in China, and also now that there are all of these global and international ties, then the market for traditional Chinese medicine has really put a dent in the population of tigers, sharks, rhinoceros, pangolins. If you have never seen a pangolin, look it up. It's a little anteater, and they are so endangered now because of traditional Chinese medicine. And, elephants for their ivory. And the other thing to say about this is the proximity of wildlife to people in these wildlife markets creates what are called zoonotic diseases, where diseases basically jump from animals to people. And so we can trace SARS and COVID to this kind of wildlife trade. Yeah, it may or may not be international, it could be from Chinese wildlife. Some people say bats, but anyway, this is a big issue. Second of all, globalization on steroids, we could say. In this sort of second stage capitalism that we're seeing in China, capitalism constantly is searching for new resources and for more resources. New markets. Did I say new resources? It needs new markets and it needs new resources. And in many cases, some of these resources are being used up within China. In today's New York Times, there's a really good study of China's fishing fleets globally, because a lot of the fish that are near to China's borders, near to China's coast, have been fished out. And so China's going globally and really fishing out the world's oceans. So the thing is that these fossil fuels, grain, fish, timber, it transforms livelihoods and landscapes all around the world. And then the third basket, you've all heard about the Belton Road, I think. So the Belton Road, these projects are funded by Chinese development banks, and they're focused on infrastructure. So this infrastructure includes deep water ports, big dams, pipelines for oil and natural gas, roads and high-speed railroads, power plants. All of these infrastructure projects. They fragment habitat, they fragment landscapes, transform habitats, they affect biodiversity and livelihoods, and they increase fossil fuel emissions because the more you trade, the more you need energy to move this stuff around, right? So there doesn't seem to be much awareness of this. They're talking about greening the Belton Road, but they're doing it in a rather superficial way. In other words, they're saying, okay, we're not going to fund coal-fired power plants anymore. But all of this habitat fragmentation and connectivity is still going full speed ahead. And you also have to ask yourself, when they're building a high-speed rail or a deep water port or an airport or something like that, is it facilitating resource extraction that's going to ultimately to benefit China, or is it really benefiting the local people? So the Belton Road Initiative, here's Yao Ming again. He's trying to help to save the ivory in the elephant. And this market in elephant ivory in China is just so enormous. It's very hard to change what has been, again, a centuries and centuries old tradition of very beautiful artwork made out of ivory. So here the Chinese have been buying donkeys, buying and slaughtering donkeys in Africa. And oftentimes the donkey is the local person's only means of transportation, but the Chinese are offering a high enough price that people feel they have little choice but to sell their donkey. And I'm sorry, I hate this slide. It's so upsetting. This whole field is full of donkey hides. And finally, certain countries have banned China from killing their donkeys because, and this is just an example here, let me change the slide, it's so upsetting. But here's an example of just how quickly and devastatingly, really, a sudden arrival of a new player with huge amounts of money can transform ways of life. So the propaganda is that this is all win-win and we have these happy Africans and happy Chinese people extracting minerals, but the reality on the ground is often very different. There's been a lot of contention in some of these mining projects, and a lot of questioning about whether the deal is really as good for the recipient country as was promised. So there was a kind of honeymoon period around the Belton Road, and now quite a number of countries are either renegotiating or kind of pulling back a little bit from some of these Belton Road projects. So what is it? You can look it up. I won't bother you with it. So here's some of the backlash. Somebody's got somebody has their microphone on. Who is it? Can you check your microphone? Okay, so here, for example, even Pakistan, which is China's best friend, they're starting to say, oops, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Sri Lanka, very famous, they took on debt that they couldn't repay. And as part of that debt, they ended up handing over control of a port to China, which is a big deal from a geostrategic point of view because China and India are not good friends, and Sri Lanka is right next to India. And now China controls a port right on the back door of India. So it's a very interesting situation. If we had time, I would love for you, I'm going to share these slides with your teachers. Sometime you'll look at some of the propaganda videos. They're really hilarious, but I don't think I can show them to you now. But they're really, really fun. And the music is really just so fun. And you can see kind of what's in the minds about the Belton Road Initiative. So the question is this really environmentalism using authoritarian means to get there? Or is it really authoritarianism that's using environmental excuses to get there? And that's what Ife and I discovered through exploring these cases in the book. So the conclusion, I think the future of the planet is in China's hands. You can also say the future of the planet is in America's hands, but I would say we have a global crisis and China is an absolutely critical player in this crisis. And so what exactly this ecological civilization ends up looking like whether China is going to be able in some ways to have a leadership role, or are they somehow going to export their model of a more authoritarian governance? You know, there's a lot to look at here, and things are changing really fast. I know Yifei is going to speak to you about China's handling of the COVID crisis, because he was in lockdown in Shanghai under COVID. That's a really interesting kind of comparison to draw to see, you know, what the state is willing to do to achieve what the state has decided is a public good. So in conclusion, is this the future of China? Panda wearing a smog mask, or is this the future of China? Thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too much or too fast, and we can open it up for questions and comments.